The desert was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. At a lone gas station, the wind stirred dust across the cracked asphalt. Engines roared in the distance, 7 motorcycles approaching fast, cutting through the heat haze. Their riders leaned forward, leather jackets creaking, helmets glinting under the harsh sun. In the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, calm and unmoved. No weapons, no entourage, just a black leather jacket, gloves, and dark sunglasses reflecting the burning horizon. The way he stood, relaxed yet deliberate, suggested someone who had long ago learned to trust patience over reaction. The leader of the bikers cracked his knuckles, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Looks like we found a movie hero," he said, loud enough for his crew to hear. Laughter erupted. Confidence radiated from the group like heat from the asphalt. They were 7 strong. He was alone. But appearances deceive. Steven didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply observed, watching the subtle shifts in posture, the way each biker's fingers brushed over handlebars, the way their weight shifted in anticipation. Each movement told him a story. Each glance revealed overconfidence. He had seen this before, in arenas, in studios, in real-life confrontations where calmness outmatched chaos. The leader took a step closer, leaning slightly toward Steven. "You lost, old man," he taunted. His words carried the arrogance of someone accustomed to power in numbers. The others nodded, circling, their engines humming like a low growl. But Steven didn't react. He adjusted his gloves slowly, methodically. The sun glinted off the leather, highlighting the smooth, deliberate motions of a man who had mastered both body and mind. There was no rush, no impulse. Every second passed with control, every breath steady, every inch of space observed. And yet, the tension thickened. The bikers thought they held the moment. They didn't realize that in calmness lies authority. In stillness lies strategy. They didn't know that one measured man can shift the energy of 7 without lifting a single weapon. The desert held its breath. Dust swirled. Engines idled. A single question hung in the air. Back-end index pointing right, what would you do if you were surrounded, outnumbered, and forced to rely only on your own discipline and calm? Steven had stopped for fuel. Just a quiet moment in the middle of the desert. Nothing extraordinary, except that in this quiet, danger often finds the unaware. The bikers noticed him almost immediately. A lone man, unarmed in their territory, exuding a calm that seemed almost unnatural. Their leader nudged his companion with an elbow and whispered, barely audible over the engines, "Look at him. He thinks he belongs here." Steven didn't move. He stood with perfect posture, hands lightly resting at his sides, observing. His black leather jacket creaked softly with each subtle shift, and his gloves, worn yet precise, reflected decades of careful practice. His sunglasses mirrored the desert sun, but behind them, his eyes scanned, calculating, noting every detail. "You lost, old man," the leader called again, louder this time. A challenge. A test. A taunt meant to provoke. The other bikers laughed, circling closer. Numbers gave them confidence. They assumed dominance. 7 men together, facing one. What could go wrong for them? But Steven didn't respond with words. He didn't scowl. He didn't flinch. Every movement he made was deliberate. Every breath measured. A slight adjustment of his gloves, a tiny shift of weight from one foot to the other, signals to the mind, not the body. Years of Steven Seagal training in Aikido and other disciplines had taught him patience. Not for show, not for film, not for reputation. Patience for understanding, observation, awareness, control. Every glance from the bikers was noted. Every footstep measured. Every flex of a muscle recorded in his mind. He could see their confidence building and already knew where it would crack. One biker nudged Steven's motorcycle with a boot. Another bumped his shoulder lightly. A third stepped in front of him, tried to block his view. "Say something," one laughed. Still, Steven remained silent. Calmness became a weapon more potent than aggression. The energy in the desert shifted subtly. Arrogance turned to hesitation, overconfidence into uncertainty. The leader cracked his knuckles again, trying to assert authority. You're just one man. You can't stop us all. Steven finally moved, a deliberate, measured step forward. Not threatening, not loud, just forward. The movement itself communicated more than words ever could. Authority, confidence, control. The bikers instinctively shifted back. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances. They were sensing, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't just an actor standing in front of them. This was someone who understood presence, someone whose calm was stronger than any roar of engines. It was a subtle psychological shift. One man standing composed against seven, and the balance of power had already begun to tip. And yet, no violence had occurred. Not yet. The tension remained electric, almost tangible. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by the idling motorcycles. The desert itself seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. In that moment, it wasn't about fists, weapons, or brute strength. It was about perception, about awareness, about understanding that real power often comes not from numbers, but from control. 7 men thought they held dominance. One man already knew they didn't. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, glinting off chrome and leather. The wind stirred faint clouds of dust, but it couldn't shake the growing unease that clung to the bikers. 7 against 1. They thought it was a simple imbalance of power. They were wrong. One of the bikers nudged Steven's motorcycle again, testing his reaction. Another bumped his shoulder lightly, just enough to provoke. Their laughter was forced now, sharper, louder, a sound trying to mask the hesitation creeping into their movements. Say something, one of them taunted, leaning forward with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Steven remained unmoved. His gaze didn't waver. Not a muscle twitched in anger. Not a single word left his lips. In the silence that followed, something shifted. Confidence wavered. A nervous glance passed between the bikers. For the first time, their numbers felt less like safety and more like exposure. The leader cracked his knuckles, a habitual show of intimidation. You're one man. You can't stop all of us, he said, voice dripping with mockery. Steven's hand moved slowly to adjust his gloves, deliberate, methodical, and almost ceremonial in its precision. Each movement broadcasted a quiet authority. Each measured breath whispered control. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply existed in a space that seemed to shrink the biker's bravado. The leader stepped closer, confident that proximity would provoke, that volume would dominate. He leaned in, searching for a reaction. The other bikers mirrored him, circling, their laughter quieter now, edges sharper with tension. But Steven remained calm. He didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't let ego dictate action. His presence alone began to reshape the energy of the desert. Subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Arrogance became uncertainty. Noise became hesitation. Power, imagined, assumed, began to dissolve. A biker reached out to push Steven's shoulder again, a last attempt to trigger aggression. Nothing happened. Silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of idling engines and the distant whisper of the wind. The man in black leather stood unmoved. In that moment, it became clear this wasn't about who could strike first. It wasn't about brute strength or numbers. It was about awareness, presence, and control. The leader's smirk faltered. His companions exchanged glances, subtle, fleeting, but telling. They were starting to sense that their assumptions were wrong. That one man, calm, deliberate, disciplined, could bend the moment to his will without raising a fist. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath, dust motes suspended midair, as if in recognition of the quiet authority radiating from the lone figure. The biker's previous swagger gave way to careful calculation. Every step they took now measured against the possibility they had underestimated. A single question hung over the scene, heavy in the dry air. How do you confront someone who refuses to fight on your terms? Steven didn't answer with fists. He didn't yell. He didn't escalate. He simply remained, controlled, precise, aware, and in that quiet, the balance had already shifted. Back-end index pointing right. Has someone ever underestimated you? and you prove them wrong simply by staying calm? In the desert, 7 men thought they controlled the moment. But one man's discipline had begun to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. The desert sun glared down, burning hot against steel, leather, and sand, but Steven remained a pillar of calm in the heat. Dust swirled around the bikers' boots as they shifted uncomfortably, sensing something they couldn't name. They had tried intimidation, noise, numbers, laughter, all the tools they relied on. But none of it had worked. Not a single reaction had come from the man in black leather. And in that silence, the energy changed. Steven stepped forward. Not quickly, not aggressively, just forward. Every step deliberate, measured, controlled. The ground seemed to respond to him, the air itself heavy with the weight of presence. Enough, he said. Just one word, but steady, unwavering. No shouting, no threats. The authority in his voice wasn't learned from movies or training for show. It came from a lifetime of discipline, mastering self, mastering calm, mastering perception. The bikers froze. 7 bodies, 7 minds suddenly uncertain. The leader, once so confident, felt a shift he couldn't ignore. Confidence cracked at the edges. The others glanced at one another, noticing for the first time that their bravado might be nothing more than an illusion. The desert held its breath. Dust danced in the sunlight. Engines hummed softly, yet the noise felt distant, almost irrelevant. All that mattered was the presence of the man before them. The one they had assumed was alone, weak, humanly ordinary. Steven didn't strike. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. Every movement, the shift of weight, the lift of a hand, the tilt of his head, broadcasted power without force. It was a quiet authority, undeniable and magnetic. The leader tried to regain control. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert dominance once more. But words faltered, swallowed by the weight of Steven's calm. Every muscle in Steven's posture told a story. Precision, patience, awareness. The message was clear without being loud. You have underestimated me. One of the bikers, younger, less seasoned, took a small step back. Another's fingers twitched over the throttle, indecision flashing across his face. The leader's smirk faded. His companions followed the subtle cues, recognizing instinctively that a mistake had been made, one born not of fists, but of perception. In that moment, fear did not scream. It settled quietly, a creeping awareness that arrogance could not withstand. Respect replaced bravado. The group's previous certainty evaporated, leaving only a silent acknowledgement. They had picked the wrong man. Steven spoke again, low and steady. This isn't about strength in numbers. This isn't about noise or fear. Real power is control, discipline, awareness. The words landed without aggression, yet they carried weight heavier than any punch or kick. The bikers absorbed them, each in their own way, realizing that the lesson had already been delivered, without harm, without chaos. They had come looking for dominance. They had assumed intimidation would work, and in return, they were met with something far more unsettling. Mastery. Not of violence, but of self. Not of others, but of presence. The desert, still and wide, seemed almost to acknowledge the moment. Dust motes hung suspended in the sunlight. Engines idled, and the wind softened. 7 men stood humbled. 1 man stood unshaken. Steven didn't need to prove anything else. The lesson was clear. Numbers can intimidate. Noise can threaten, but discipline endures. Control endures. Calmness endures. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. And in that pause, the bikers knew they had misjudged more than a man in black leather. They had misjudged the consequences of arrogance. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever been underestimated and shown your strength simply by remaining calm? And just like that, the reveal was complete. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and the lesson, quiet, potent, undeniable, would linger long after the dust settled. The desert remained silent, save for the low hum of idling engines and a whisper of wind over sand. 7 bikers had come seeking dominance, confident in their numbers, certain that a lone man could be overwhelmed. But now, that certainty had vanished, replaced by something unfamiliar, doubt. Steven didn't move quickly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every slight adjustment of his black leather jacket, every careful tilt of his head, every measured shift of weight conveyed more authority than the loudest roar of engines. The bikers, once brash and aggressive, felt the weight of a presence they hadn't anticipated. The leader, whose smirk had carried so much arrogance, stepped forward in a final attempt to regain control. "You can't stop us all," he said, trying to inject bravado into his words, hoping to mask the creeping uncertainty he now felt. Steven shook his head slowly, deliberately. His voice was calm, measured, resonant. "You don't see real strength," he said. "Numbers, noise, and intimidation don't define it. Discipline, awareness, and calmness do." For a moment, the words hung in the dry air like the desert sun itself. Inescapable, undeniable. The leader faltered. The others glanced at him, searching for guidance, but the certainty they had relied on was gone. In its place was a growing awareness. They had miscalculated. One biker whispered quietly, almost to himself, You could have humiliated us." His voice trembled slightly, betraying both fear and awe. Steven's reply was simple, steady, and devoid of any malice. "I didn't need to. Real strength is about teaching lessons without harm." The statement sank deep. The bikers realized that intimidation, when faced with awareness and discipline, was fleeting. Force can be temporary. Fear can fade. But presence, control, and preparation endure. They had come expecting a fight, expecting conflict, expecting to assert power. Instead, they had encountered calm mastery. They had met someone who didn't react impulsively, who didn't escalate, who understood that the truest lessons are delivered without chaos. The leader's hands flexed at his sides. His companions shifted uneasily. All seven now recognized something they hadn't before. Arrogance can collapse under the weight of quiet confidence. Numbers alone mean nothing when confronted with awareness, patience, and strategy. Steven took a deliberate step back, not as retreat, but as demonstration. He was in control, even in apparent inaction. Every eye followed him. Every mind recalculated. What they had assumed would be a simple encounter had become an education in presence, a lesson in respect, a demonstration of the consequences of underestimating someone who had mastered self-discipline. "Strength," Steven continued, his voice calm yet firm, "is not for domination. It's for understanding, for protection, for teaching. Those who rely solely on noise and aggression will always falter. Those who cultivate awareness endure." The words hit home. The biker's previous bravado had no foundation against a mind trained in patience, perception, and restraint. Every action, every decision, every twitch of muscle in Steven's stance communicated a lesson far deeper than a punch or shove ever could. Even the youngest, least experienced biker sensed the shift. Confidence had once radiated from the group like heat from the sun. Now it felt hollow. Vulnerability replaced certainty. They were learning, slowly, uncomfortably, that real strength doesn't scream. It observes. It waits. It teaches without harm. The desert itself seemed to recognize the change. Dust hung motionless in the sunlight. Engines hummed softly. Even the wind seemed to respect the space Steven occupied. The seven men had come seeking dominance, but they were leaving with something far more profound, an understanding that perception, calm, and control outweigh noise, numbers, and intimidation. For a moment, there was silence. Not the oppressive silence from the start, but a reflective, heavy quiet. Seven bikers, humbled, aware, reconsidering every assumption they had made. One man, disciplined, observant, patient, had demonstrated a truth that would linger far longer than this encounter. Real power endures when exercised wisely, silently, and with restraint. Backhand index pointing right. Should strength be used to protect or to dominate? This was more than a confrontation. It was a lesson in life, a demonstration that arrogance, unchecked, collapses in the face of calm awareness. that preparation and discipline are more powerful than numbers and noise, that sometimes the greatest victories happen without a single strike, without a single scream. And in that desert, beneath the blazing sun, 7 bikers came to understand a truth that would stay with them long after they left. That the measure of a person isn't what they can destroy, but what they can teach, simply by being steady, controlled, and aware. The desert sun hung high, blazing over asphalt and sand, but Steven's calm presence seemed to absorb its heat rather than be affected by it. The bikers remained frozen, uncertain, hesitant. The earlier bravado, the loud voices, the confident gestures, the joking threats, had dissolved into a quiet tension, subtle but undeniable. One man alone had shifted the balance without raising a fist. Steven moved toward his motorcycle, deliberate and unhurried. Each step carried intention. Every motion communicated control. The black leather jacket, gloves, and dark sunglasses were more than clothing. They were part of the impression, part of the discipline, part of the presence he commanded. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to provoke. His aura alone was enough to reset the energy of 7 men who had once thought themselves untouchable. He lifted the motorcycle upright with ease, an effortless demonstration of both strength and calm. It wasn't showy, and it wasn't meant to intimidate. It was simply a statement. Preparation, skill, and awareness make challenges manageable. 1 man with control is stronger than 7 with arrogance. The leader swallowed hard, lips pressed together, knuckles still cracking nervously. He had expected a fight, a display of force, a chance to assert dominance. Instead, he had found patience, discipline, mastery. Steven finally spoke, calm, steady, resonant. No one needed to get hurt to understand a lesson. You chose disrespect. You assumed weakness. You learned consequences. The bikers shifted, subtly at first, then more noticeably. They had come seeking dominance, expecting chaos and perhaps even fear. What they received instead was clarity, the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who knew himself and the world around him. Even the youngest among them, previously the most eager to provoke, felt the shift. He glanced at his companions, then back at Steven. His posture softened. The leader, though still holding himself upright, could no longer mask his uncertainty. Every subtle move Steven made reminded them they were not in control, not in the way they had imagined. Steven swung onto his motorcycle with deliberate calm. No sudden motions, no rush. Every detail executed with precision. As he settled onto the seat, dust swirled around the wheels, and the engines hummed in quiet anticipation. The bikers watched, mesmerized, as one man's discipline had effectively neutralized their assumptions of power. Real strength, Steven added quietly, almost as an afterthought, comes from calm under pressure. It isn't about who can shout the loudest or dominate with numbers. It's about awareness, presence, and control. The bikers absorbed the statement, each in their own way. There were no arguments, no outbursts, only the quiet recognition of a lesson delivered without violence, without humiliation, without chaos. The desert itself seemed to acknowledge the moment. Dust motes hung suspended in the sunlight. Even the wind seemed softer, as if respecting the authority that had been quietly asserted. For a long moment, time itself felt suspended. The 7 men understood, even if unconsciously, that they had miscalculated. They had assumed dominance came from noise, aggression, and confidence in numbers. They had underestimated the subtle power of discipline, patience, and observation. Steven started the engine, smooth and controlled. The low growl resonated in the open desert, but it wasn't a roar meant to intimidate. It was an extension of his presence, a signal of readiness without threat. The bikers stepped back instinctively. One, then another, their postures subtly yielding to the calm authority before them. 7 men had thought they controlled this desert. One man had shown them who truly held power. Not through fists, not through threats, not through aggression, but through the quiet strength of preparation, awareness, and unwavering calm. Back-end index pointing right. If you believe real strength comes from remaining calm under pressure, comment below. The lesson was clear. Arrogance falters in the face of awareness. Numbers, bravado, and noise are temporary. Discipline, control, and patience endure. One man's actions, measured and deliberate, had shifted perception, dissolved assumptions, and delivered understanding, all without a single punch thrown. As Steven eased forward on his motorcycle, the dust rising behind him, the 7 bikers remained standing, reflective, humbled, and silently absorbing a truth that would last long after this encounter. They had sought confrontation. They had found instruction. And the desert, vast and still once more, bore witness to the quiet assertion of authority, patience, and the enduring power of calm. The desert returned to silence. Dust settled slowly, curling around the black leather of Steven's motorcycle as he eased it forward, leaving faint tracks on the cracked asphalt. 7 bikers remained, standing in the heat, still processing what had just happened. What they had expected, a fight, a show of force, a moment to assert their dominance, had never come. Instead, they had been met with something far more powerful: calm, controlled presence. Steven rode slowly at first, feeling the engine hum beneath him. Not loud, not threatening, just deliberate, measured. A continuation of the authority he had silently exerted moments before. Behind him, the bikers watched, reflective, humbled, their earlier arrogance replaced by understanding. The desert itself seemed different now. The tension that had hung thick in the air lifted. The leader, once so brash and certain, swallowed hard. He glanced at his companions. None spoke, but the weight of comprehension was visible in their postures. Subtle shifts, hesitant movements, eyes meeting and flicking back to the retreating figure of Steven. They were learning, perhaps for the first time, that power is not measured by noise, numbers, or aggression. True power is the quiet kind: discipline, awareness, patience. Steven didn't look back. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered without a single punch, without shouting, without harm. The desert had borne witness to an encounter that would leave a lasting impression, not through fear, but through clarity and understanding. He had demonstrated something fundamental. Arrogance collapses under awareness. Bravado fades when confronted with patience. Noise may dominate briefly, but calmness endures. Numbers can intimidate, but they cannot teach. Real strength, Steven knew, is measured by how one acts when no one else is dictating the pace. It's shown in preparation, in restraint, in controlled action. The bikers' earlier laughter and mockery had vanished, replaced by quiet reflection. They had assumed dominance would be easy, that one man alone could be intimidated. They had misjudged both the man and the principles he embodied. In that moment, they realized that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned, and sometimes it is earned most effectively without violence, without humiliation, simply through discipline and self-control. Steven eased the motorcycle into a gentle rhythm, the soft purr of the engine blending with the wind and the faint shift of sand. Every movement was deliberate, a statement that presence alone can communicate authority far more effectively than aggression. Behind him, the bikers absorbed this truth, feeling it in the pause between words, in the stillness that carried far more weight than any punch ever could. He had shown them that power is not a display, it is a mastery of self. It is control over impulses, over environment, over perception. The bikers' initial intentions, rooted in disrespect and bravado, had been deflected not by fists, but by awareness. The lesson was subtle, profound, and enduring. And yet, Steven didn't linger to explain. He didn't need to. The demonstration itself spoke volumes. Every subtle movement, every measured breath, every decision to remain calm under pressure had imparted the understanding. Arrogance, unchecked, collapses in the face of prepared discipline. As the motorcycle's wheels crunched against the desert gravel, a final thought lingered in the air. One man, disciplined, patient, and aware, can alter the course of multiple lives simply by demonstrating the consequences of assumptions and disrespect. No one was hurt. No one humiliated. Yet the impact was undeniable, lasting, and transformative. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think the bikers learned their lesson? Backhand index pointing right. Could you have walked away like Steven, calm and in control in the face of arrogance? This wasn't a story of victory in the traditional sense. There were no bruises, no fights, no dramatic confrontations. It was a story of principle, of demonstrating that strength is not measured by what you can destroy, but by what you can teach. It was a reminder that calm, awareness, and discipline endure far longer than noise, force, or intimidation. Stephen's presence faded into the distance, dust trailing behind him like a silent signature of mastery. The desert returned to quiet. Yet the lesson remained. For the bikers, for anyone who might witness it, for anyone who might hear this story. True power is calm. True strength is control. Arrogance collapses when faced with preparation and awareness. Respect is earned through presence, not through fear. And sometimes, the greatest victories come not from violence or noise, but from quiet discipline and measured action. Speech balloon comment below. Have you ever been underestimated and shown your strength by staying calm? Thumbs up like if you believe respect matters more than numbers. Repeat button share with someone who underestimates the quiet ones. The encounter ended not with chaos, but with clarity. Not with defeat, but with understanding. And in that vast, sun-drenched desert, one man had shown that the deepest lessons are often the quietest, the most controlled, and the most deliberate. The bikers had arrived seeking dominance. They left with reflection, respect, and an understanding that real strength, the kind that lasts, is measured by awareness, calmness, and the discipline to act without aggression. And as Stephen rode off, the desert whispered a simple truth. Mastery over self is the most powerful force of all.